Mara Whitlock had not slept in a bed in 11 days, and she had learned that libraries were the only public places in the city that let you sit for 6 hours, without anyone asking why you weren't somewhere else. She was 17. She had left her stepfather's house with a backpack, $43, and a laptop she'd bought 2 years earlier with babysitting money, back when she still had a reason to save for something. She told herself she would go back when she had a plan. She had been telling herself that for 11 days. What she had instead of a plan was a habit. Every afternoon, on the library's public computers, she pulled up financial filings the way other people scrolled social media, not because anyone made her, but because numbers were the one thing that had never lied to her or promised her something they didn't intend to keep. Her father had taught her that before the accident that took him when she was 11. Sitting at their kitchen table, showing her how to read a balance sheet like it was a story with a beginning. After he died and her mother remarried a man whose temper filled every room he stood in, the habit was the only thing Mara had kept from that kitchen table. She read filings the way some people prayed on the 9th day. On a public terminal at the downtown branch, she was reading the quarterly report of Voss Meridian Group, a logistics and freight conglomerate whose CEO, Richard Voss, had been on the cover of a business magazine she'd flipped through at a newsstand that same week. Smiling under a headline about resilience and growth in a difficult market, she wasn't looking for anything. She was killing time before the library closed, and she had to find somewhere to be for the night. But 3 pages into the cash flow statement, something didn't sit right, a receivables number that had grown too fast against. A revenue number that hadn't grown at all. The kind of mismatch her father used to call the gap where the truth goes to hide. She almost closed the tab. She had nowhere to sleep that night, and a stranger's company's books were not her problem. But she pulled the filings from the 2 quarters before, and the 2 before that, and the gap wasn't new. It was old, and it was growing quarter over quarter, the way a small lie grows when nobody catches it early enough to make it stop. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Richard Voss had built Voss Meridian from a single warehouse. His father left him into a freight and logistics empire spanning 4 countries. And for 11 years, the company's growth story had been the thing investors, employees, and Richard himself had organized their lives around. What almost none of them knew, what only Richard and his chief financial officer, a careful, anxious man named Elliot Pham, actually understood, was that the growth had stalled 2 years earlier, quietly, in a way that could still be managed if nobody looked too closely. Elliot had proposed at first cautiously and then with the practiced ease of a man who has told himself the same story often enough to believe it, that they could smooth the numbers, recognize revenue a little early, push certain losses into future quarters where, presumably, better numbers would absorb them without anyone noticing the difference. It wasn't fraud, Elliot told himself and told Richard. It was optimism with a spreadsheet. Richard had let himself believe that too. Because the alternative, admitting the company he'd spent his life building was quietly failing, was a kind of grief he wasn't ready to sit inside of. Mara did not know any of this. She knew a mismatch. She spent 4 more days building the picture, moving between library branches when one closed for the night, cross-referencing public filings against news reports and shipping industry data she found through open government databases, filling a notebook with numbers and handwriting that got smaller as her confidence in what she was looking at got larger. By the 13th day of being gone from home, she had assembled on paper, in a backpack she now carried everywhere because she trusted no locker to keep it safe, a case that a company worth $11 billion had been misrepresenting its financial health to investors and employees for roughly 2 years. She did not know what to do with it. She was 17, homeless by her own choice, but homeless all the same, and she understood. With the clear-eyed practicality of someone who had already learned that adults did not automatically believe children, that walking into Voss Meridian's headquarters and asking to speak to someone would get her removed by security. Before she finished a sentence, so she found a financial journalist, a mid-career reporter named Diane Okafor, who who had written skeptically about Voss Meridian's growth numbers 18 months earlier in a piece nobody had paid much attention to at the time. Mara created an anonymous email account at the library and sent Diane her notebook, photographed page by page with a short message that said only, "I think this is real. Check the receivables against the last 8 quarters. I can't give you my name, Diane." Almost deleted it. She got messages like this weekly, most of them nothing. But the specificity stopped her. The anonymous sender hadn't made accusations, had shown work, cited exact line items and exact quarters. In the meticulous handwriting turned photograph of someone who clearly understood what they were looking at better than most analysts twice their age, Diane spent 4 days verifying what she could through public sources and industry contacts. And by the end of those 4 days, she had enough to know the tip was not nothing. It was potentially the story of her career. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Voss Meridian's stock dropped 19% before noon. Board members who had trusted Richard Voss without question for a decade began asking questions with a different tone. Richard, blindsided, called an emergency meeting of his executive team and demanded to know how a reporter had gotten numbers that specific, that accurate, sourced 2 line items buried in filings that even his own board rarely read closely enough to catch. Elliot Pham Pale said he didn't know. He was not entirely lying. Neither of them yet knew the source was a runaway teenager sitting in a library 3 miles away, watching the story unfold on a public computer with her backpack between her feet, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, which was that the thing she'd noticed had mattered. The dark part came fast. Diane, under pressure from her editors to reveal or at least characterize her source before the paper would run a follow-up investigation, quietly worked to trace the anonymous email. It wasn't hard. Libraries logged terminal usage by library card and 1 library card. Checked out under Mara's real name 11 days earlier because she'd needed it to use the computers at all, led straight back to her. Diane found her on the 14th day, sitting at the same terminal at the downtown branch. And instead of a security guard or a subpoena, a woman in a wool coat sat down in the empty chair beside her and said quietly, "I think you sent me something." Mara's first instinct was to run. She had 11 days of practice at recognizing threats, and this felt, for one long second, like one. But Diane didn't reach for a phone or raise her voice. She said, "I'm not here to expose you. I'm here because what you found is real, and it's about to become a very big story. And you deserve to know what happens next before it happens to you instead of with you." What happened next was that Voss Meridian's board, facing a securities investigation and a stock price in freefall, forced Richard Voss to either explain the discrepancies publicly and completely or step down. Richard chose, after 2 sleepless nights that stripped away 11 years of a story he'd told himself about who he was, to do both, to resign as CEO and to personally cooperate with regulators in unwinding exactly what had happened and why. A decision his lawyers advised against and that he made anyway. Because somewhere in those 2 nights he'd remembered his father telling him, when he was young and the warehouse was still small, that a business built on a lie was not actually his to keep. Before the resignation was finalized, before the regulatory filings, before any of the formal machinery, Richard Voss asked Diane Okafor one question in the 2-hour interview he insisted on giving her personally, who found this. Diane, who had promised Mara confidentiality and meant to keep it, said only that her source was someone with an unusually precise understanding of financial statements, who had asked to remain anonymous. Richard, a man who had spent 30 years around analysts and forensic accountants. "What?" said, "That's not a professional's language. That's someone who taught themselves." Diane didn't answer. Richard didn't press further, but something in the way he said it stayed with her. And stayed with Mara when Diane, without naming names, described the exchange to her the next day at a coffee shop that had become their meeting place. Richard Voss stepped down publicly on a Thursday. What almost no one but Diane knew was that he'd asked her privately whether the source would ever be willing to meet him, not for the press, not for the board, but for himself, because he wanted, he said, to understand who had seen what a decade of executives and auditors had missed, and because he needed for reasons he didn't fully explain. To say something to that person directly. Mara said no the first 3 times Diane asked her. She had spent 11 days learning not to trust powerful men who wanted things from her. And Richard Voss, however contrite the headlines made him sound, was still the man whose company had built the lie she'd unraveled. But Diane, who had by then learned enough of Mara's situation to understand the stepfather. The 11 days, the library card that had given her away, gently pointed out that Richard Voss was not asking as a threat. He was asking as someone whose entire understanding of his own life had just been rearranged by a 17-year-old he'd never met. And some part of him needed to look at that fact directly instead of only reading about it in a filing. Mara agreed to meet him on the condition that Diane sit in the room, and that if she wanted to leave at any point, no one would stop her. They met in a small conference room at the newspaper's offices. Neutral ground, gray afternoon light through tall windows. Richard Voss, 61, is no longer the man from the magazine cover, but someone visibly worn thin by 2 weeks he hadn't seen coming. Stood when Mara walked in, which surprised her more than anything he said afterward. He said, "I don't know how to start this, so I'll just say it. You found something that 11 years of people paid to find it missed. I want to know how." Mara, standing near the door, backpack still on her shoulder, out of 11 days of habit, said, "My dad taught me to read filings when I was little. Before he died, it was the last normal thing we did together, so I never stopped doing it." Richard was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm sorry about your father." She said, "I'm not doing this so you can apologize to me." He said, "I know. I'm doing it anyway, because it's true, and because I don't think anyone said something true to you in a while, based on what Diane's told me." He paused. "You're sleeping in libraries." Mara didn't answer that. Richard said, "I'm not going to pretend I know what that's like. I've never once in my life not known where I'd sleep. But I know what it's like to build something around a lie you tell yourself, because the truth is too heavy to hold. And you were the only person who looked at what I built closely enough to see it wasn't holding either. Said I'd like to help you. Not as payment. Not as a trade for silence, because there's nothing left to keep silent about. I'd like to help you because what you did took a kind of courage I'm not sure I've had at any point in the last 2 years. And the least I can do is make sure it doesn't cost you your future," Mara said. "What does that mean? Help?" Said, "It means whatever you need it to mean. A safe place to stay that isn't tied to conditions. School, if you want it, you clearly don't need help with the parts I could teach you. Legal support if you want to formalize your situation with your family or apart from it, whatever's safest for you. I have resources. I'd like to put some of them somewhere that isn't a boardroom for once." Mara looked at Diane, who said nothing, letting the decision sit entirely with her. Mara said, "Finally, I don't want it to be about you looking good," Richard said. "It won't be public. I'm not telling this story to anyone. You've already told the only version of it that matters." She was quiet for a long moment, turning her father's old habit over in her mind, the way he'd taught her to look, past what a number wanted you to believe, and find what it actually meant. She said, "Okay, start with somewhere I can sleep that has a door I can lock myself. And we'll figure out the rest," he said, done. Tonight, 6 weeks later, Mara was enrolled in school under a legal arrangement Richard's lawyers had built with a family services advocate. Living in a small apartment with a caseworker checking in weekly, not because Richard owned any part of her life now, but because he had funded the kind of transition support that usually only exists for children, whose situations make headlines. And hers, quietly, without a name attached, had. She kept the notebook. She started a second one, this time filled with the beginnings of what she wanted her life to look like, instead of what she was running from. Richard Voss did not return to the company he'd built. He testified fully before regulators, paid what the settlements required, and spent the months afterward out of the public eye. Teaching an evening class at a community college on financial literacy and ethics and accounting, using without ever naming her, the story of a mismatch between receivables and revenue that someone once explained, to him in a gray conference room with more clarity than any auditor he'd ever hired. On the evening, Mara moved into her apartment. She taped a single index card above her desk. It read, "The gap is where the truth goes to hide. Look there first." It was word for word the thing her father used to say, and it was now. Also true of the year she had just survived, in a way she hadn't expected and didn't try to explain to anyone. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, has someone ever underestimated what you were capable of right before you proved them wrong?